Imagine a world where the maps are complete. The satellites have seen every inch of dirt, and every secret has been neatly catalogued by science. We like to believe that we are the masters of our domain, having peered into the deepest trenches and scanned the highest, most frozen peaks. But what if the vastness of our planet still holds pockets of the prehistoric, places where the rules of the modern world simply do not apply? Throughout history, humans have shared whispers of giants lurking in the shadows, creatures that bridge the gap between the known animals and the ancient monsters. From the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest to the suffocating heat of the Amazon, the legend of the hidden megafauna persists across every single culture. We call them Bigfoot, the Yeti, or the Mapinguari, treating them as campfire stories or punchlines for tabloids. But the psychological roots go much deeper. Why does the human mind insist on populating the empty spaces of the map with large, bipedal primates that seem to vanish like ghosts? Perhaps it is because for most of our evolutionary history, we weren't the only intelligent, upright apes walking through the tall grass of the Pleistocene. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors shared the Earth with cousins like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the massive, enigmatic Gigantopithecus blacki. This giant ape, standing nearly 10 feet tall, lived in the jungles of Southeast Asia until it vanished from the fossil record roughly 300,000 years ago. Is it possible that the monster in our collective subconscious is actually a lingering genetic memory of a real struggle for survival against a superior titan? Or perhaps the mystery isn't about the past at all, but about the terrifying realization that nature is far larger and more indifferent than we care to admit. Take, for instance, the Pingualuit crater in Quebec, a perfect circle of crystal-clear water isolated from the rest of the world's complex river networks. It is a pristine laboratory of time, filled only by rain and snow, holding secrets that have remained untouched for over 1 million years of history. When we look at such places, we don't just see geography, we see a sanctuary where the impossible might still find a way to breathe and thrive. The search for these creatures often begins with the strongest evidence, usually consisting of grainy photographs, plaster footprints, and hair samples found on jagged rocks. In 1951, explorer Eric Shipton photographed a massive, distinct footprint in the snow of Mount Everest, sparking a global obsession with the abominable snowman. These traces feel like a bridge between our reality and a world of wonder, giving us a tangible reason to believe that the wild remains unconquered. However, as we move from the romanticism of the explorer to the cold precision of the laboratory, the narrative begins to shift in unexpected ways. To find the truth, we must stop looking through binoculars and start looking at the very building blocks of life hidden within the environment itself. The most promising frontier in this investigation is environmental DNA, or eDNA, a technique that allows scientists to sample a landscape for its genetic inhabitants. Just as a criminal leaves fingerprints at a crime scene, every living creature leaves behind microscopic traces of skin, hair, or waste in water and soil. In 2014, geneticists Brian Sykes and colleagues published a study analyzing 30 hair samples attributed to mysterious creatures like the Yeti and Bigfoot. Using advanced sequencing technologies, they hope to find a unique, undiscovered primate genome hidden within the DNA databases of the modern world. Instead, the findings were overwhelmingly mundane, showing that most samples belong to known animals like bears, cows, horses, and even humans. Yet, within the data, a fascinating anomaly appeared. 2 samples from the Himalayas matched a prehistoric polar bear fossil from over 40,000 years ago. While this doesn't prove the existence of a Yeti, it suggests that creatures long thought extinct may have survived in isolated pockets much longer than expected. This highlights the incredible difficulty of tracking rare or hidden animals, especially in environments that are actively hostile to human investigation. The jungle of the Amazon, for instance, is not just a forest, it is a breathing, decomposing entity that consumes evidence faster than it can be recorded. The rumored Mapinguari, a massive, sloth-like creature from Brazilian folklore, is said to be impervious to bullets and possess a second mouth on its belly. This description closely mirrors the Megatherium, a giant ground sloth that lived in South America and interacted with the first humans to arrive on the continent. Is the Mapinguari a cultural memory of a real titan, or is it a psychological projection, a way for humans to explain the terrors of the unknown? Anthropologists suggest that legends of hidden megafauna serve as a cultural mechanism for teaching children to fear the dangers of the deep forest. In this sense, the creatures are very real, not as biological entities, but as powerful ideas that shape human behavior and environmental awareness. But scientific curiosity compels us to ask if there are biological entities behind these ideas, even if the evidence is frustratingly fragmented. If a creature is large enough to leave footprints, it must also eat, reproduce, and inevitably die, leaving behind a physical trail for us to find. The problem is scale. Looking for a single hidden species in the vast, dense wilderness is mathematically similar to finding a needle in an infinite haystack. Our tools are getting better, moving from grainy video recordings to drone surveys and environmental DNA sampling that can detect a creature without ever seeing it. Yet, the more we learn about the complexity of ecosystems, the more we realize how little we actually understand about the limits of survival. Some argue that if these creatures existed, we would have found bones by now, forgetting how quickly the jungle recycles organic matter back into the soil. If we accept that the physical evidence is lacking, we must turn our attention to the philosophy of science itself. What constitutes proof? For centuries, the existence of gorillas was treated as a sailor's myth, a drunken tale of monstrous hairy men living in the African jungles. It wasn't until 1847 that Western science officially recognized them, transforming a legendary beast into a biological fact through rigorous observation. This teaches us that the boundary between fantasy and reality is often just a matter of adequate observation and the willingness to look in the right place. But the modern world is not the world of the 19th century. We now have satellite surveillance and DNA monitoring covering a significant portion of the globe. The likelihood of a large, unknown mammal surviving undetected in these monitored areas is astronomically low, though not entirely impossible. Perhaps the creatures we seek are not biological entities in the traditional sense, but remnants of extinct species that have been biologically minimized by evolution. In ecology, the island rule suggests that large animals on islands tend to shrink over time, while small animals tend to grow, adapted for limited resources. Is it possible that isolated pockets of humanity or large primates have survived by becoming smaller, faster, and more elusive, adapting to a world dominated by us? This would explain why footprints are sometimes found, but the creatures themselves are never seen, as they have learned to avoid any open ground. The search for hidden megafauna is ultimately a reflection of our own fear of being alone in the vast, indifferent expanse of the universe. We want to believe that there are still wild places, that we haven't entirely conquered nature, and that magic still exists in the shadows. However, the scientific pursuit of these myths forces us to reconcile our romantic desires with the harsh reality of population, biology, and habitat constraints. For a population of large creatures to survive, it requires a minimum number of individuals to maintain genetic diversity and prevent inbreeding. That number is usually in the hundreds, if not thousands, which makes the idea of a single, lonely Bigfoot wandering the forest biologically unsustainable. This suggests that if these creatures exist, they must exist in functioning ecosystems, interacting with their environment, eating, and interacting with other species. The silence of the jungle is not just the absence of noise, it is the presence of an ecosystem that has not been mapped or fully understood. What if the creatures are just cleverer than us, having developed behaviors specifically designed to avoid detection by the very tools we use to find them? In the end, science does not have to disprove the existence of these creatures, but rather provide a more compelling explanation for the sightings. We must ask ourselves if the mystery is truly about the creature in the woods or about the nature of our own need to believe in the extraordinary. As we stand on the edge of the known, looking into the green abyss, we must acknowledge that science is not just about finding answers, but about asking better questions. The legend of the hidden megafauna is a mirror reflecting our own psychological landscape, our fears, our hopes, and our desperate need for a world that is still large and untamed. If we finally prove these creatures exist, we might be disappointed to find they are just animals struggling to survive in a shrinking habitat, not magical beings. And if we prove they do not exist, we are left with the cold, sterile reality of a world that is fully mapped and entirely under our control. The beauty lies in the tension, in the possibility that a creature as massive as a titan could walk right past us without ever being seen. It suggests that the map is not the territory, and that our understanding of nature is perpetually incomplete, filled with invisible gaps. Perhaps the true giants are not the flesh and blood monsters of folklore, but the immense ecological systems that operate on timescales beyond human comprehension. The Amazon is a giant, the ocean is a giant, the climate is a giant, and their movements are far more impactful than any bipedal primate. By focusing on the myth, we may be missing the larger, more profound mystery of how life itself adapts and survives against overwhelming odds. Whether the Yeti is real or not is perhaps less important than the ecological reality that the mountains it would inhabit are rapidly changing. The search for the unknown compels us to preserve the wild, to keep the last corners of the map blank, and to protect the places where myths can still live. Our journey through the forbidden zones and the dense jungles has shown us that the real value of these mysteries is the curiosity they ignite. They force us to look closer, to think harder, and to appreciate the complexity of the living world that surrounds us in every direction. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that we are still part of nature, not separate from it, and our stories are just another way of describing reality. The impossible to access places are not just geography. They are sanctuaries of the unknown that protect the planet's remaining biodiversity from our relentless expansion. If we can learn to cherish these unreachable spots, we may find that the true monster we need to fear is not hidden in the forest, but within ourselves. The question is not whether these creatures exist, but whether we are capable of creating a world where they could exist without being destroyed. As our technology advances, the empty spaces on our maps will continue to shrink, leaving us with fewer places to look for the extraordinary. But as long as we retain our sense of wonder and our desire to explore, the mysteries will simply shift from the physical world to the world of knowledge. In the end, the map may be complete, but the story of the Earth is still being written, and we are its authors, explorers, and custodians.